We now return to Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Policy Institute, the radio show discussing the honest truth about Illinois policy and politics. Here's AM 560's Dan Proft.
Dan Proft back with Austin Berg, writer at the Illinois Policy Institute, in this edition of Illinois Rising, and some below-the-fold election results at the state level here in Illinois from the November 8th election. Madison County voters down in southern Illinois, Metro East area, just outside of St. Louis, Madison County voters passed a referendum capping the amount the county, now just the county, but nonetheless, the county controls what the county can do, can pass a referendum on election day, capping the amount the county can collect in property taxes, capping the amount the county can collect at 0.2% of a property's value. Maybe this is an idea that could be scaled under the rubric of property tax reform in Illinois.
You would hope so, because you have all these local governments, and by the way, we have the most units of government in the country by far. These government bodies every year eke up their levy just a little bit, just under the cap, just under the cap, just under the cap. No approval from voters, no discussion. Let's just get what we can get. And that leads to, in places like Madigan County.
Yeah.
If only he was there, maybe their tax burden would be lower.
If only we was limited to there.
So we had, in Madison County, their property tax burden is up 40% over the last 10 years. That's the property tax bill as a percentage of their income. It's now about $2,300 a household there in Madison County, which is by no means an extremely prosperous place. That's falling mostly on middle-class taxpayers. And that story is repeated throughout the state, where you have people with property tax bills that are larger than their mortgage.
One other idea in this category of property tax reform, and considering Illinois has the highest property taxes in the nation, kind of a salient topic, is something Colorado did some 20 years ago, which is to amend the state constitution to prohibit state and local government from raising taxes without voter approval, also prohibiting state and local governments from spending revenues collected under existing tax rates without voter approval if revenues grow faster than the rate of inflation plus population growth. It's the old Taxpayer Bill of Rights that was popular in small C conservative policy circles in the 90s and somewhat kind of disappeared. And perhaps it's time it reappears in the land of Lincoln. For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined by Rob Nadelson. He is a law professor, 25 years, worked as a law professor at multiple universities, expert in constitutional law. He is also a policy wonk at a number of think tanks, including the Heartland Institute here in Arlington Heights, Illinois, as well as the Independence Institute in Colorado and the Montana Policy Institute in Bozeman, Montana. Rob, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate your time.
It's great to be with you.
So as we're wrestling with how to rein in spiraling property tax increases in Illinois, and we have some weeds growing through the pavement in parts of the state, what's the experience of Colorado with its Taxpayer Bill of Rights that may be instructive for something that Illinois policymakers could consider?
In 1992, Colorado put into its constitution by voter initiative a comprehensive measure that limits taxes, spending, and debt. This, by the way, is not in any way unique. A number of states have these, and limits on taxes, spending, and debt have been in state constitutions really since before the 1840s. But they're not all equally effective, and over the years, Colorado's limits had eroded in various ways. So this measure was adopted in 1992, and its primary mechanism is to allow a vote of the people when taxes or spending or debt rise to a certain extent. It's been very controversial, as you would imagine. There are folks who have never been reconciled to it, who wage guerrilla warfare and sometimes open warfare against it constantly. But there's no question, in my mind anyway, having looked at the evidence, that Colorado has benefited enormously from it. We were in a very deep recession at the time it was adopted. We shortly came out of that, and we've been one of the fastest growing states economically ever since.
So, Nate, we have the, Rob, excuse me, we have the this Irish Catholic guy in Illinois who doesn't much care for voter-initiated ballot referendums. What are the odds of people being able to compel their lawmakers directly to sort of institute this type of thing down the line?
The kind of restriction we're talking about is called a tax and expenditure limitation, or TEL, T-E-L. And economists and other researchers have been studying them for years. And one of their conclusions is that the best ones are the ones that come from the voters. That if the legislature tries to craft its own resolution, even if it takes the form of a constitutional amendment, it usually looks like Swiss cheese because they give themselves so many outs. In fact, if it's not adopted by voter initiative, it may be worse than nothing. Because if they go ahead and they adopt something that looks like a limitation, but really isn't, then that gives them political cover for tax increases and spending increases that they wouldn't otherwise have.
And to I'm sorry, but to your point, didn't that sort of happen in Colorado, or am I misremembering? Didn't Bill Owens, Republican governor, didn't he water down the Tabor in Colorado during his tenure?
Yeah, to a certain extent. There is a better analogy, though, from Colorado. Colorado had a legislative limit, and the legislature regularly came up against the limit, and then it would exceed the limit. And so, if anything, spending accelerated when the limit was created by the legislature. Now, Bill Owens was a big supporter of the Taxpayer Bill of Rights when it was passed, and for several years thereafter. Mm-hmm. But you're right, when he was governor, he supported an initiative which critically weakened the expenditure part of the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. The part that requires votes on taxes is still largely, not entirely in effect, but the expenditure limits have been weakened, and that was partly because a Republican governor changed his mind once he was in office.
And so that this is really mission critical. You have to have kind of both sides of it, right? And the idea of, which is fairly rational, the idea of limiting expenditures to no more an increase year over year than population growth plus inflation seems a sensible indexing and that forces the political class to live within its means. And if you don't have that kind of hard line, then you're going to see what you're describing occur.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the fact is the political class, as you put it, is very well organized and much better organized than most of the rest of us who are out there working for a living in our own businesses. And they think constantly about ways to increase taxes and spending. So you do need some kind of a constitutional restriction. There's another thing, too, which I think isn't really on a lot of people's radar screens, but is important. As an economy advances, the amount of the economy that you devote to any particular good or service should decline. We spend a lot less on food, for example, than people had to. We spend much less of our income on food than people had to spend, say, 200 years ago or 100 years ago. We spend less on clothes. We spend less on commodities. By the same measure, over time, the share of government, the share that government takes from the economy should decline, not stay the same or increase, but decline. And in many states, the opposite is happening. That's not the evidence of a good economy, and it's not a harbinger of a good future.
And to your point about how it's benefited Colorado, the argument would be made in a state like Illinois, oh my gosh, you're going to starve K through 12 education, for example, of resources. Nobody will ever learn to read or do simple math again in Illinois if you do this. What's been the experience in Colorado in terms of the quality of K through 12 education?
Well, of course, the education lobby complains, and I should clarify and say the public education, the government education lobby complains a lot. But there's a lot of evidence out there indicating that above a certain level spent everywhere, there's no particular connection between the quality of schools and the amount spent. People say, well, why is that the case? And the answer is there are a whole lot of reasons, but that's the reality. And that reality has shown up in Colorado as well. Colorado test scores and other indications of educational quality have done just fine, even though, of course, the people who run the public schools claim they never have enough money. As a practical matter, what happens is, in all too many cases, when you do give them additional money, it goes to things like, diversity counselors and administrators, rather than into the classroom where it belongs. So it generally speaking, in the private sector, we get our greatest productivity growth when things are tight. When the businesses don't have all the money they think they need and they have to make do, that's when they really make progress. And the thing is generally true in the public sector as well. You have to keep a fairly tight leash if you want government to get better. Yeah,
excellent point. He is Professor Robert Nadelson, Senior Fellow in Constitutional Jurisprudence at the Heartland Institute here in Chicago Metro, the Independence Institute in Colorado, as well as the Montana Policy Institute. Professor, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.